a lot of the similar duties that the VP Ed has right now. WUSA as an organization is something that I've been volunteering a lot for throughout my undergrad, and I've done a lot of great work and met a lot of great people in my tenure as VP Ed. There's still some projects, though, that I would like to finish up. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to have an additional 8 months to do so and support the new board as we undergo this governance transition.
Great. So you already talked a bit about this in your opening statement, but just for some of our viewers who might not know this, can you talk about what drew you towards running again this year after your term? Also, can you talk to us about the experience that you will be bringing to the table, both from your year as VP Ed as well as any involvement before that?
That was a lot of questions in one. Sorry, can you repeat that quickly?
Right, just what drew you towards running for re-election, as well as what experience are you, can you elaborate on your experience both within like the past year as VP Ed as well as any prior student government experience before that?
Yeah. I guess what really drew me to re-election, I mean, part of it is that we're transitioning to a new structure, and a lot of things, at least in my mind, I don't think they've been hammered out quite to the extent that I would like. So I very much feel a lot better about the sort of future of WUSA, just being around to provide additional support with sort of knowledge and expertise that I have as we transition to this new system. But beyond that, I just find that I really enjoy my role. It's been difficult at times and very stressful. And some sort of opportunities that the VP Education might usually have access to, unfortunately, did not happen because of COVID-19. But now, as we're returning back to a more sort of state of normal, you know, there's a lot of things that I would very much appreciate being able to do. I'll say, in terms of my experience, sort of outside of WUSA specifically, I was chair of the Waterloo Environment Student Endowment Fund. I was involved with my faculty student society, so ESS, my program student society. I've been really involved in environment, in orientation specifically. And before becoming an exec, I was student counselor for about two and a half years. I think I ran in a by-election once and sat on a bunch of committees. I'll say that like the VP Ed role is one that I've been, you know, thinking about for a rather long time. There was a previous person who sat in the role for 2 years who was in my program who I was rather close to. So I had a chance to talk to him about a lot of the work that he was doing. And I was really interested in it. I've also been a delegate for the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, which is the provincial advocacy body that WUSA is a part of. And just, you know, being able to engage with other student leaders and have debates and discussions about provincial policy. It was kind of an extremely nerdy thing to do, but I got a lot of joy out of doing it and throwing myself into it. So, you know, if this is something that I enjoy, something that I can bring sort of my expertise to, and I can help other people, you know, learn the tricks of the trade, then, you know, I'm happy to do it and continue doing it. Eventually I do have to move on, but I figure an additional 8 months in the grand scheme of my life isn't going to hurt.
Thank you. All right, so for our next question for you, can you explain in your own words how WUSA as an organization functions and how WUSA advocates on behalf of students?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a tricky question because how WUSA functions, you know, there's lots of different things that WUSA does. And I'll say that when it comes to more of the operational and financial components, those are things that I'm personally less aware of. I can speak a little bit more to how Advocacy works. But even how advocacy works is, again, a little bit tricky that I've been like trying to spend a lot of time on. But I guess my beginning thoughts on this is advocacy is any action that an individual or set of individuals take in order to influence the decision of decision makers. So, sometimes it takes the form of having meetings with stakeholders, so meetings with like politicians or the university, but it's also other things as well, right? Like having protests, engaging with, regular constituents and getting them sort of riled up. Um, information educational campaigns, all of those things help develop an argument for a certain course of action. And in addition, advocacy is also, especially if you're providing specific recommendations to someone on what they should do, it involves doing research. It involves writing policy. So there's all these little steps and things that occur. Generally, when WUSA does advocacy, it's usually through Students' Council or through one of the committees. I think it's really important when we do any sort of advocacy that is more than just, one person's sort of decision on where we ought to go. When we're creating recommendations or when we're speaking, on behalf of the student body, I think it's really important that the student body is involved in what recommendations we're making and that we're cognizant on how it impacts, different populations. One recommendation that might be good for domestic students might not necessarily help international students, and vice versa. But yeah, it's essentially just a lot of identifying the problem, trying to figure out what solutions there possibly are, and then picking whatever mode of convincing a decision maker makes the most sense. And sometimes that's through writing letters or budget submissions or meetings. Other times it's through different methods. So there's like a weird process to it, but it's also, I would argue, simultaneously an art to figure out, how decision makers tick and what sorts of things are going to be the most impactful to get them to be, what's the word again? Sympathetic to the issues that students face.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. That was really comprehensive. Now, moving on, can you talk about what projects do you think WUSA has done well in the past year?
That's a good question. Personally, I'm kind of hypercritical of everything I do. Yeah. I mean, I'll say that like I spent a lot of time trying to respond to a lot of the issues that were coming up as we were returning to campus. So particularly around late November, December, we were realizing a lot of students could not find housing. And that was a huge issue that we tried to jump on. And I feel like I've tried like many things in order to make things easier for students, including asking the administration to basically mandate the professors to provide online recordings of lectures and ways to, pass your classes or take assessments from home if you were unable to consistently come onto campus. And I feel like I did the right steps there, but ultimately, I'm not sure how many students that ended up helping because the university did not mandate anything. They recommended to professors, and I hope a couple of professors made life easier for students. But ultimately, like changing the decisions of decision making are a lot harder. I guess one win that we did have was with regards to the impact program. Being introduced onto campus. So the impact program is something that was trialed at the University of Guelph before it hit us. But it's essentially having a mental health nurse on campus who, whenever there's a mental health emergency, is able to go out with campus constables and sort of intervene in that scenario and assess whether or not it's the best idea to bring the student to the emergency room. And like, honestly, in a lot of cases, it's not. Um, I've been in that situation myself, and generally you just end up sitting there for like 5 hours or so in the emergency room until they make you talk to like a doctor, and the doctor says, well, you don't seem like an immediate danger to yourself right now, so I guess you can go home. But it is a really traumatizing situation for myself and other students who I've known who have been in similar situations like that. Also, just in general, we hear from our racialized students that, campus constables can make them uneasy, particularly when they're vulnerable and in a mental health emergency. A lot of the times having campus constables there isn't always going to be the most helpful thing. So I think sort of expanding, our idea of like who's there to help. Because there are a lot of calls, I think, from like across the world to have mental health nurses and professionals being able to respond because they are more trained to do so. So that was something that we managed to get on campus. And to my knowledge, it's only us in Guelph that have that program right now. So, yeah.
Thank you for also speaking to some of the things that I think can be improved on in the future. Can you take us one step further with that? What specific goals do you have for your next year with WUSA? And given that you have previous experience with the organization, please speak to both projects and initiatives you want to continue and new projects and initiatives you'd like to introduce.
Yeah, so a project that I'm really interested in continuing is the Committee on Access and Disability. So prior to becoming exec, something that I really noticed was there wasn't a lot of peer-to-peer support available for students with disabilities. A lot of the time it was only accessibility available. And sometimes it's really hard to have your documentation accepted. It's a little bit problematic to me, I think, that you have one office that is both the gatekeeper of accommodations, but also the folks that are assigned to advocate on your behalf. Because at that point, if they're being sort of unwilling or if there's a problem there, there's no one you can really turn to. And like, personally, I had a lot of issues earlier in my undergrad trying to get accommodations, trying to navigate those processes, even just dealing with the fact of being at a hyper competitive school with a disability and, what that meant for me. Like, am I not good enough as a person? Like, those questions tend to hit people a lot when, they have disabilities that impact their productivity. And I think it's really important that that there is disability pride and that people do have sort of the tools and the connections to figure things out about themselves. So the Committee on Access and Disability was created sort of last year in order to expand on the accessibility report that WUSA did, identifying some of the problems with accessibility services, but also other issues sort of on campus. And core to sort of disability advocacy is, nothing about us without us. There's a lot of groups that are extremely well-meaning and try and advocate for disabled individuals. But, a lot of the time, it sort of feels like, people doing stuff for you, well-meaning, but you can do it yourself, right? You don't necessarily always need other people speaking on your behalf. And I feel like that is something that really hits a sore spot for the disability community, because there's a big problem with infantilization. But yeah, so that committee has been doing a lot of advocacy work around disability on campus in different ways. But also something that I sort of identified, sort of independent of my thoughts on it, is that, it would be handy to have a student-run disability service. And, it might not take the form of like Raise or Glow or Women's Center in terms of that. I think we can be a little bit more open in terms of what that service looks like. But there is an identified need, an identified want for a place for students with disabilities to engage and interact with one another and talk about disability. So something that I'm really hopeful for is, enabling the Committee on Access and Disability to continue existing, continue to do all the good work that they're doing, but also submit a proposal to the new board of directors in order to create a student-run disability service. It isn't going to happen like super quickly because unfortunately creating a service takes a while. There's a lot of steps that need to happen. But I feel like if I can give other students with disabilities sort of the tools to advocate for themselves and to figure out what they want the future of, I guess, campus to look like in terms of that, then I'm doing my job. Other than that, I would say housing is a huge thing on my mind. So we have the municipal election coming up in October. And I know that basically all levels of government right now are talking about housing, generally more so for home buyers and first-time home buyers and whatnot. Students are a very sort of unique population in Waterloo especially. And I'll say that just over the summer, there's a lot I learned about municipal policy and why certain things can happen and why they can't in the context of the municipality. And I'd like to continue doing more work on that. I'll say that like the housing reports that we created over the last couple of years, like they're good, but they don't have specific, municipal or provincial facing recommendations. A lot of it focuses on, information sharing with students so that they're aware of their rights and yada, yada. But when it comes to, the fact that there's very few companies that own a lot of the real estate around the university. Like, is that something that we can address? So I really want to do a deep dive in terms of what sort of solutions are available there. But yeah.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. Moving forward, could you talk about what part of WUSA's 2020 to 2025 long-term plan do you think you will be spending the most time working on during your term in office?
I'll admit I have not looked at the strategic plan in quite some time. When we were creating our annual plan, we were asked to make sure that everything mapped over to the strategic plan. So I do know that what I've been working on does map over, but admittedly, I've been working off of the annual plan that my team had created, as opposed to looking at the strategic plan in a while. From what I do remember, though, one of the items had to deal with providing students with quality volunteer and professional development opportunities. And I guess, like, what I'm interested in doing on that front, I guess, like, I feel like I would be working specifically on that item, mostly just because, like, we've been talking about the need for an advocacy committee, so that it's not only the board sort of making decisions on what we should advocate on, and we can get a more diverse range of people. But something that's really important to me when it comes to like on-campus advocacy, for example, a lot of academic decisions occur on a faculty level. So a lot of the folks who are able to make change are really the faculty society VP academics or VP educations. They vary in name. but equipping them with sort of the knowledge and the tools in order to make changes happen. And I find that the societies very much differ in terms of how much background information their volunteers have and how much of an understanding those folks have about like the change that they're able to make within their faculties. But yeah, I'd say broadly, when it comes to the committees, something that like I really want to make sure that we do is make sure that the committee members, receive training, have proper sort of background information on how to do change, and like nothing that would necessarily be super prescriptive or anything like that, but at least give them the tool set. Because trying to work all this out was not easy when I started. I learned a lot of it through experience and through mentorship and talking to other folks. And I want there to be avenues for mentorship with folks who aren't in elected positions in quite the same way. But yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie. So you touched on this a little bit in your answer, but so your platform says that that one of your priorities is to ensure that it's not just the board setting WUSA's advocacy stances and there's a broader group involved. You talked about potentially having an advocacy committee. Could you elaborate on what this would look like, how students would be engaged with this committee?
Yeah, so a discussion that kept coming up when we were talking about the new bylaws and the new governance system at Student Council was, again, folks wanting an advocacy committee. In my mind, and what I'm sort of hoping for is not to have a singular advocacy committee, but to break it up based on specific problem areas. And it's still something that is being developed and worked on. Ultimately, Council asked for a document outlining how advocacy will work underneath the new governance model. And that's a document that I've already brought to the Education Advisory Committee for first reading. So I'm still receiving feedback, and I'm hoping to get that approved a little bit later for the final council. But like currently the plan is to divvy things up based on problem areas. So having one based on government relations, one based on academic affairs, one based on co-op specifically, and one based on sort of like the services on the university. Kind of difficult to describe. Things like accessibility services, campus wellness, sort of just having to do with like the services that we have access to us as students in the campus life environment and sort of advocacy that might happen there. But yeah, and then making sure that there's representation from different folks. So when it comes to the academic advocacy group, I think it's really important to have all of the undergraduate senators on that because a lot of academic policy is passed through UWaterloo Senate, but also having the faculty society AVPs, sorry, not AVPs, VP academics or VP educations, having any directors that will be working specifically on academic issues, part of that committee. When it comes to the other ones like government relations type thing, I'm still trying to figure this out, but I'm wondering if it makes sense to have representatives from different faculties. Because I'm not really sure that there's going to be large differences between faculties, if that makes any sense. Like I could see the argument for having like an international student, right? Because like provincial policies and federal policies will impact them differently. I can see the argument for having representatives from the satellite campuses because their needs in their respective municipalities are very different. I'm not opposed to having faculty representatives, but I'm just wondering if there's other ways to divvy students up to make sure that we have expertise in the different areas that we need. I'm also hoping that there'll be a couple of at-large student roles as well, just so that your average student, if they're really interested in these topics, can join in and get involved. But yeah, that's something that's still being hammered out, and I'm ready to receive feedback from the folks on the Education Advisory Committee on those.
Thank you for your answer. That covered a lot, including some stuff we're going to get into with later questions. But I do want to take a step back first and talk about student engagement. So as you pointed out, your hope is that students who are already really interested in these topics and really engaged will have an opportunity to participate. However, generally student engagement with WUSA has been quite low. Many of the elections have been uncompetitive. There have been like low turnout at general meetings, that kind of thing. What steps will you take in the next year to help communicate what WUSA is doing to students and other stakeholders?
That is a good question. I'll say that's something like I've realized over my undergraduate experience and through talking to students, is that students tend to be very busy, distracted, or not distracted, but they're focused on co-op, they're focused on academics. And there's a lot of folks trying to get their attention at any one time. In general, I think what's more important is if they want to know what WUSA is doing, to have that information easily accessible to them. You know, I think that we can throw as many emails and flyers or whatnot their way, but if they're not in the headspace to receive that information, they're not going to receive it. But you know, when they're ready to ask questions about what's going on in their student government, having that readily accessible, I think is really important. Something that I do personally that I hope sort of helps is like I am quite active on Reddit, answering student questions and engaging with them. So I hope that I'm approachable enough that if anyone has a question or concern, that they're able to reach me. But again, I think a lot of it is just like the information being there about, you know, boards' annual plans, what advocacy projects that they're working on, you know, that be readily available. Something that like I've tried to do this year is whenever there was something that, you know, was the big issue or the topic of, I guess, the week, because a lot of things do seem to catch on fire or blow up every now and then, is, you know, doing a Reddit post or asking the WUSACom folks to post a story or post something to establish like, hey, here's what we're doing to work on this problem, and reassuring students that there is action sort of being taken on it. But yeah, no, I don't know. I've seen so many people try to like communicate with students and like let them know what's going on. And maybe I'm just a little bit cynical at this point. But again, I think you can only throw so much information their way.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. Moving on, so under this new governance system, we will have a single governing body, a board, as opposed to a council. And well, boards tend to be more secretive. For example, board meetings, unlike council meetings, may not be open to the public. So given this, how would you ensure that there's accountability to the student body under this new system?
Yeah. I'll say that apparently it is not super unusual for student associations to have a single governing body, which honestly sort of surprised me, because I was sort of used to the idea of there being a council and a board. I think that the way to sort of balance that is that you can have specific confidential sessions for items that, you know, need to be private. But, you know, there's a lot of things that like don't necessarily have to be private. And it's a matter of like identifying what are things that like, you know, benefit from being private conversations and what aren't, and not sort of overdoing it. Again, it's a little bit difficult, I believe, for like me to speak on particularly, because I find that like the president and the VPOF are the folks who usually understand the mechanisms of board a lot better than I would say the VPSL and VP Ed do. I'm present during board meetings, but in terms of picking and choosing what needs to be private, I think is a lot more difficult for me to suss out, I suppose. And I think it's really going to be important to have a presidential candidate who sort of understands that, as they're the one who would be chairing board, and would be preparing the agendas and would be flagging whether something needs to be confidential or not.
All right, thank you for that answer. We're going to sort of pivot back to what we were talking about earlier. One important thing WUSA does is advocacy for all students, but also often advocacy for students who are in more marginalized positions. How will you ensure that WUSA continues to advocate for marginalized groups on campus?
Yeah. So something that I'm hoping to do with the different advocacy committees is specifically for the one that deals with student life, I suppose, is sort of what I'm going to generally call it, is to have representation from specific marginalized groups, but also from the equity services. I'll say that like a conflict that I've been like cognizant of over the last couple of years now. This is kind of like weird for me to explain, I guess. So like when I started university, I had some friends who really wanted to engage with some of the equity services, and they found that ultimately it was not the right community for them. That they tried to make certain changes throughout, but they were not, the right type of, I guess, marginalized that I think that the folks who were running the service at the time, thought was the right way of being. And it's something that like I've heard from students, typically those in STEM faculties, like not feeling welcome in some of the equity services. Like I do think that they do a lot of great work. They definitely do, and I've engaged with some of them, and I've had a good time. But simultaneously, like I do think that like students who have those concerns and those experiences, like that shouldn't be undermined or overlooked. And I think something that's really important with any advocacy work that WUSA does is that there's communication and accountability as to what we're advocating on, and that's something that like isn't necessarily really present in any of the services now. Whenever they engage in an advocacy project, like they don't really let council know, which I think is like really important, because I do think that say if GLOW is advocating on behalf of queer students, that it's not only the queer students who volunteer at GLOW who get to dictate that, but also the queer students just across campus more generally. And ideally, I would like to have a place to have those conversations, so that we can, hear what are the concerns that the equity services are hearing, and hear about what sort of work that they want to do, but also hear from other students who might be experiencing similar or different issues who also belong to part of those communities. But yeah, I'll say for yeah. No, you can go.
Thank you, Stephanie. So moving on. So one of the roles of the VP would be to do government-facing advocacy. So could you share what would some of your advocacy priorities be at the provincial level?
Yeah. So generally, when it comes to our provincial advocacy, we try and lobby alongside other student associations, particularly our partner schools at the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance. We can obviously still advocate sort of on different issues, but I find that it gets quite cluttered when every single student association is advocating for something different. So generally, we agree upon a set of 4 or 5 advocacy goals that we have as WUSA schools. So the ones for this year is our sector sustainability. So that sort of refers to the fact that, like, so universities get funded in 3 ways. They receive operating grants from the province, they receive domestic tuition and international student tuition, and operating grants have not increased according to inflation for many, many, many years. And the lack of sort of investment by the provincial government into post-secondary institutions is what drives international student tuition to be so high and to be so unregulated, but also just a lot of decreasing in service hours, and improvements to infrastructure in our university when it comes to making things more accessible. It's usually they focus on building the big shiny buildings because building a wheelchair ramp is not something that when you advertise, it doesn't seem that impressive, I guess. So focusing on issues like that is one of them. Another one is gender-based and sexual violence prevention and response. What else? Other one is barriers to access for rural and northern students. So that will probably be addressing things with the lack of interregional transit. What's the last one? Affordability. So those are probably going to be the sort of top priorities there. And I guess for like WUSA more independently, housing is obviously going to be a very big one. And we have a couple of accessibility asks on file as well. And I know that there's some work that some folks want to do about access to healthcare resources for trans students, just because there's actually not a lot of medical practitioners who specialize in that, just within the Waterloo, Burlington region. And that's causing some big problems, but I can get into that another time.
Okay. I am going to go back to housing. So you brought up housing here, and you've mentioned housing in your Reddit AMA, and of course, WUSA focused a lot on housing over the past year. I know the organization plans to advocate for changes at the legislative level, the provincial government, to look into what changes can happen at the municipal level. I also know that you are exploring the idea of WUSA-related housing, like housing run by WUSA, for example. Can you tell us a little bit more about what WUSA housing would look like?
That idea is still very much in its preliminary stage. I think the one concern that I have about that is, so WUSA is like a nonprofit organization, and we're empowered to exist because the university lets us exist. Like, by law, the university needs to let there be a student association, but not necessarily us. And there's a couple of things that being underneath the university makes tricky for us in terms of getting loans from a bank, because we don't have anything to give as collateral to our own. And there's also restrictions about like owning property. So I'm wondering if like the restriction around owning property is going to be the problem when it comes to establishing WUSA housing. There's also a question of, can we actually build affordable housing? Because arguably the campus residences are supposed to be affordable, right? Like they're supposed to look out for the best interests of students, but even then, those are quite expensive. But yeah, Again, it's definitely something that we want to look into, but like there's a lot of considerations that have to be made. So I'm not sure it's going to even be able to happen. I'll say that like the current BPOF is probably the one better positioned to speak to some of the barriers and complications that might exist. Because again, I think that like being a nonprofit and then building housing and then having to charge rent on that might be in conflict with like if it doesn't meet our current mandate. So we might have to create a separate organization from WUSA in order to do that. But I haven't looked fully into all those things. I know research was done to figure out what other student associations that own housing have done in the past, but as it turns out, there's actually not a lot of student associations that have built and own and operate their own housing. I think it's a very creative idea, and it can definitely help. I just don't know how feasible it's actually going to end up being.
So thank you for that, Stephanie. Moving on, PD has been a major concern for students, and so so we're interested in knowing what are your opinions on the current PD requirements that students have.
Yeah. So I'm not in a co-op program, so I don't really think I'm allowed to have an opinion on PD if I've never had to do it myself. I guess the only thing that like I'll say for context for folks, and I've mentioned this on Reddit before, but a lot of faculties have moved away from having work term reports, which I think students are very appreciative of. But currently the thing that is allowing there to be no work term reports is the reflective components that exist in a lot of PDs right now. So there's sort of a risk that if you get rid of PD, that you end up having to bring back the work term reports. And at that point, I think we have to ask a question of which is worse. I definitely do understand why students are frustrated with PD. You know, from what I've heard, you know, some of the PD courses are very common sense or they don't have value to them. Simultaneously, though, I've heard some students who like actually very much appreciate them, particularly in that they allow them to get certain certificates. I know that there's like a research one that's associated with taking some PD courses. I mean, at the end of the day, I think if students are interested in getting rid of PD, the way to do that is probably not going to be from like a WUSA board member advocating for it, because co-op has their own data on PD. There are course evals that are done at the end of every PD. And earlier in the year when we were having a conversation about PD, you know, they brought up the fact that, you know, it was generally fairly positive responses in those surveys. And I would argue that like those surveys like should be more representative of student opinions if those surveys are accessible to every student. Like if you want to get rid of PD, you have to make those survey results change. If you feel very strongly against PD, like you're going to have to say that PD is the worst thing possible and vote it down and get other people who feel that way to vote that down. And that will likely make co-op change their mind. But I think like me or another board member standing there and saying, hey, students say that PD sucks, get rid of it. They're not going to accept that, right? Like I've seen people try and do that before. It's those survey results that you have to change, that I really think is pivotal there. But
thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you for answering all our questions. So as we moving on towards the end of the debate, or the interview, in fact, could you give us, could you summarize your platform with a closing statement?
Yeah. Sorry. COVID makes my brain not work very well.
If you want to take a minute and think about anything you want to add. go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I guess my closing statement is, you know, a lot of changes are happening within WUSA, but also the broader campus life environment as we return onto campus. I hope that in my capacity as VP Education, I've sort of proven myself as someone who is able to respond to the issues, is knowledgeable about the issues, and also is willing to involve other student leaders in the process. And if, you know, any of the work that I've done, and if any of the way that I hold myself is something that, you know, you appreciate, I'd be honored if I am able to serve another 8 months. I can bring a lot of resources and knowledge to the forefront, and sort of the advantage for me is that I've already sort of acclimatized to my role and the needs. September is going to be a very busy time for everyone. And having someone who already knows the ropes, I think, is going to be very important. But moreover, someone who is able and willing to mentor incoming board members, I think, is also very essential. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time today to answer our questions. I think that's everything.
Coolio. Thank you so much for preparing the interview questions and for being the video face of this interview.
Thank you. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Feel better soon.
Bye.